Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Once again, we are continuing on our series Chess Lessons from Grandmasters, and today we are looking at pawn endings. If you recall, in our last video, we had a pawn promotion endgame where White King had a single pawn that was sufficient enough to win the game. However, in this position, the Black King also has a pawn, but this time the White King has two pawns at his disposal. So how does White proceed with this game to ensure a victory without a stalemate? Now, instinctively, the first move that could come to mind is moving the pawn to f6. White could argue that if Black takes the pawn and White recaptures, White is going to be in this premium alignment that we love, where White King is opposite the Black King and it's Black's turn to move. Such that if Black moves away to e8, then the White King can control the queening square. But if the Black King moves to the queening square, then the White King can then just push the pawn, force Black King away, and then control the queening square. However, things do not always work out as you plan, because Black also has some ideas up his sleeve. Because if White plays pawn to f6, Black would not recapture. I know it seems counterproductive, but that is the way Black draws this game. Because if Black moves to g8, guess what? If White recaptures the pawn, Black recaptures, and there is no way for the White King to win this game. Because if you remember from our pawn endgames, there are two principles that we need to win a pawn endgame. First and foremost, the White King should be in front of his pawn, not beside, not behind his pawn. And also, the White King should have an intervening square between himself and the pawn. So if you look at this position now, the White King is beside his pawn. So there is no way the White King can be able to protect this pawn up onto the point to control the queening square, because the Black King would always be in front of the moving piece. There is no way we are going to proceed to a win here. So let's go back to our initial position. What does White need to do in this position in order to win? If you recall, in our previous videos, during the pawn promotion endgame, wherever the Black King moves, the White King moves adjacent to that position. So that's exactly the principle we are going to use here. So we can see that the Black King right now is on f8. The White King is going to move adjacent to that position to d7. And now all of a sudden, the White King is controlling all the squares in front of the Black King, such that the Black King cannot move any closer to the White King, but rather will need to step backwards. Then the White King can then approach. Once again, the Black King does not have any other squares in front of him, and needs to step backward to h8. So what does the White King do? He sacrifices a pawn. Now, the advantage the White King had was his extra pawn. But now, he's sacrificing his pawn. Why? This is to ensure that he does not stalemate. The Black pawn captures the White pawn, and now the White King moves towards the Black King. Of course, the Black King does not have any squares to move to in this position. We have confined the Black King to just this h8 square. However, because of that pawn sacrifice, the Black pieces now have a pawn that can move. So it is not a stalemate. Now, the white king can then check the black king. The black king moves away, and now we promote to a queen. However, if we had hesitated to sacrifice that piece, you can see that there is no way for the white king to capture the black pawn without leading to a stalemate. Because right now, if the white king approaches the black king any further, the black king would no longer have any viable squares to move to. So let us look back at the position. So the white king moves adjacent to the black king. The black king steps away, and then the white king moves forward to confine the black king to fewer number of squares. Once the black king is confined to the h8 square, we then sacrifice a pawn such that the black pieces would always have a pawn that can move to prevent a stalemate. Afterwards, we can then control the queening square and then promote our pawn into a queen. Now let's take a scenario where we have the same number of pieces, but this time there is a distance between them. So they are separated from each other. In this position, we could instinctively want to control the squares around the black king by moving our pawn from f4 to f5 so that it controls the light square on e6. So if the black king wants to approach the position, it takes longer. The black king will have to go back, and our white king can then move towards the black king and control even more squares. However, this does not work because immediately white moves the pawn to f5, the black king does not go after the pawn, but rather he sacrifices his own pawn and ensures a draw. Let us look at this position. So let's say the white pawn takes on g6, then the black king moves towards the pawn. The pawn tries to advance, the black king moves towards it, the pawn advances to a queen, the black king then takes it, and then our white king moves forward to control squares in front of the pawn. The black king comes back, and we see we have a problem. Remember, in the king and pawn endgame, there are two principles to ensure that we win the game. The white king should be in front of the pawn, and there should be an intervening square between the white king and his pawn. So as you can see, the white king here is in front of his pawn. But is there an intervening square between the white king and his pawn? No. So this game is going to end up in a draw. No matter how we try, the black king is always going to move to the front of whichever piece is moving. So we can see the problem. We are going to just continue in the same routine up until we end up in a draw. The correct move for white is to move the king to protect the pawns. Remember, in the endgames, kings are supposed to protect their pieces and confine the opponent's king. So right now, we're in the middle of the board. The white king cannot confine the black king to fewer number of squares. So what should he do? He should protect his pieces, moving from d4 to e4. Now, of course, the black king will try to be opposite the white king and will move from d6 to e6. So what do we do next? Now we can push our pawn from f4 to f5, and the result is a lot more different. The king moves to f6, and now our white king can then move to f4. Now this time, when the black king pushes his pawn, what does white do? He pushes his pawn also, because the white king is now protecting his pawn, and now these pawns can now be used to force an attack. So the black king moves backward, and now we control more squares. The black king moves to e6, and now the white king moves opposite the black king. So now the black king cannot move anywhere forward, so it will have to move backwards. And then the white king approaches to confine the black king to fewer number of squares. Now the black king moves backward, and we have a peculiar problem. Now, if you look at this position, it looks like our conventional king and pawn endgame. Remember, in the king and pawn endgame, we need an intervening square for the white king to be able to control the queening square, or else the black king will just forever move to the front of the white king or the moving piece. So for instance, if the white king approaches the black king in this position, all black has to do is to move in front of the white king, and we end up with a drawn game. We'll continue with this sequence of moves forever, and black will just keep on repeating, and at some point the game will end up in a draw. There is no way to progress with this move. So what do we do instead? The right move for white in this position is once again to sacrifice a piece. He moves his pawn for the king to pick. The king has no other option. He has to pick the piece. White moves adjacent to wherever the black king is. And in this configuration, the white king can then create an intervening square between himself and his pawn. So what does black do? Let's say for instance, black moves back to f8 and the white king moves to e6. Then this time, if the black king moves opposite the white king just moves towards the pawn and picks the free pawn. And all of a sudden, white is completely winning here. So of course, that is not what black is going to do. Black is going to move to protect his pawn, and the white king will do what? Control more squares around the black king. It will move from e6 to e7. And now as you can see, all the squares in front of the black king have now been controlled by the white king. So the black king will be forced to move downwards towards g8. White can then move to f6 to pick up the pawn. When black moves to protect his pawn, white can then move downwards to force the king to h8. And once the king moves down to h8, white picks up the pawn, and of course, it's game over. No matter how white tries to play it, there is no way he wins in this position. White controls the queening square and wins the game. So this is how you play the pawn end games when they are separated apart. Let us reset the position and look at what we've considered. So in this position, don't forget, white does not move the pawns immediately, but rather white moves the king to protect the pieces. And then once the pieces are protected, the king can then attack with the pieces while protecting his pieces. Then the white king confines the black king to fewer and fewer number of squares. And once it becomes a king and a pawn end game, white ensures that there is an intervening square between the white king and his pawn by sacrificing a pawn and moving adjacent to the position of the black king. And then we continue with our simple principles of chess of confining the king to fewer number of squares, picking the pawn, and then moving the king to control the queening square. And that is how we play the pawn ending, where white has 2 pawns and black has 1 pawn. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as you can see, Sometimes you need to give some to win some. The sacrifice of a pawn in these positions is usually very important for us to win and avoid a draw.